and out into one of the villages nearby. At that time, the village was very small. Just a few hundred people lived there, and it was surrounded by fields and farms. In that particular village, my parents found a house. It was actually more like a mansion. It was big enough to fit both of my parents' businesses and a big family home. Before moving in, my parents decided to make huge renovations to the home because it was very old. The years went by quickly, and we were all very happy to live there, and nothing seemed to be out of the normal. Until one night. I remember it so clearly, even though I was only 6 years old. It was the night before Christmas, and I was lying in my bed, totally awake and excited for Christmas. I wanted to see if I could catch Santa Claus putting down presents in my sock that was hanging outside my door. So I made sure I had a light on in my room that night. I was probably awake for almost an hour when I started to slowly give up and go back to sleep. This was in the middle of the night, but I still decided to leave the light on. Just when I was about to close my eyes, I saw my door open very fast. It was almost robotic. It didn't slam against the wall at all. It just opened rapidly, and I couldn't see anybody. Suddenly, I heard heavy, fast footsteps coming my way. The footsteps were so heavy that I could really feel the anger in whatever it was coming for me. The footsteps stopped next to my bed. Then suddenly, somebody or something threw me into the wall that was next to my bed. I hit my head on my nightlight and found myself glued to the wall, paralyzed with fear and total shock. What just happened? It took me several minutes before I even had courage to yell for my mom. When I told her what happened, she tried to explain it all by saying it was a bad dream. But I knew that I had not been dreaming. After that night, things would happen every night to me. I couldn't sleep anymore, and as a young girl, this affected me badly in my social life and in school. I was terrified of my home, and I was getting scared of myself because nobody would give me an explanation of these events. Eventually, I convinced my dad to get me a bunk bed. But to this day, I find it hard to fall asleep close to the ground because I do not feel safe. When I finally got the bunk bed, the events eventually stopped, but never fully. Still, there would be nights when this thing would terrorize me from my sleep. I never slept through the whole night there. I would wake up every night and feel the tension in the air. It was so strong at all times in that house, especially in my room, where there was a weird feeling that kept me on guard all the time. I could tell you millions of things that happened to me there, what I saw, felt, and heard. But the next experience I'm going to tell you was by far the worst one I have ever had. The last goodbye. I was 18 years old, and we were going to move back into the city again. There was only 1 week left, after which we were going to leave that house forever, so we had to take down my bunk bed. Admittedly, I was a bit nervous about that, because it had been many years since I had slept close to the floor. The nightly visits had stopped for a long time, and the only thing that would happen was that I heard light footsteps on the floor above me every night. But they would always stop, and that was it. I knew they would stop, and at least it wasn't in my room anymore. first night of lying close to the floor, I had a dream. I was in my room, but there was no furniture or windows. The only thing I saw was my door. In my dream, I was looking at it, and I started to feel a slight case of dread, like something was behind that door and had wanted me to enter. The days went by quickly, and for almost every day for a week, I would have the same dream. But somehow, it woke me up feeling worse and worse. I started to wake up covered in sweat in the middle of the night. And one of those nights, I woke up and found I was unable to hear a thing. I was looking outside my window and saw the branches of the trees violently slamming against the window, but there was no sound. Absolutely nothing. The air in the room was so thick, and there was a violent presence there. It was as if something was going to explode at any moment. This freaked me out, so I put the blanket over my head and tried to go back to sleep. I eventually did. Morning came, and it was going to be my last night in my childhood home. I felt a bit sad about it, because it contained a lot of nice memories as well. My parents had to take the last drive to our cabin, which was 1 hour away, to put away some of the furniture we couldn't move in the new apartment. They decided they were going to spend the night there, and my brother would join them. At that time, I had just started dating a guy, so I decided to stay in the house. Big mistake. I spent the whole day with my new boyfriend, and when I took the bus home, it was already dark outside. I would have stayed at my boyfriend's place if I still didn't have things to pack for the move. I'd been alone in that house many times before, and I knew what I was getting myself into. But I could never have expected what was about to come. Some hours went by, and I finally decided to go to sleep. After talking to my boyfriend on the phone for about an hour, I tucked myself to bed and looked around the room. It looked weird without all the furniture, but my thinking was disturbed by a sound from the floor above me. The footsteps. But I wasn't scared. I knew that it would stop soon, so I didn't pay attention to it much. But this time, instead of just fading away, the steps finished with a hard slam. It sounded like somebody stomped their foot in pure anger right above me. The stomp scared me so much, I sat up instantly. I stopped breathing and moved my eyes to the roof, listening. And then it began. Somebody or something began running around the floor above me, and it was fast. I froze and didn't move a muscle. The running lasted for several minutes. Then, it started to run up and down the stairs that were almost right outside my door. The steps sounded inhuman, as if somebody with 4 legs was running up and down, up and down. I started to freak out and scream something like, "Stop! Go away! Go away!" The running stopped. But it stopped outside my door. I stared at the door handle and felt a chill down my spine. The dream I had was making itself real. and I started to shake in fear. It must have been some kind of warning all along. And now it was too late. I'm going to die, I thought, and I started to cry, fearing the thing outside my door was going to get into the room. Without a sound, I saw the handle slowly pushing itself down. I stopped breathing, too terrified to do anything. Then, it began to push itself up and down quickly, and at the same time, I would hear knockings on the door. It sounded like 10 people were standing outside, all knocking on the door at the same time. The sound became overwhelming, and I started to scream. For some reason, my fear turned to anger, and I cursed the thing until it eventually faded away. The knocking stopped, and the handle became still. That's when I finally could breathe, and with my hands shaking, I grabbed the phone to call my boyfriend. It was very late, but I needed to hear somebody's voice. I didn't tell him what happened. I pretended I had a very bad dream. I never told him what really happened that night. I was afraid that he would think I was crazy. The next day, my parents picked up the last things, and I was finally sitting in the car with my back to the house. I didn't even turn to look back as we hit the road. I had had enough. As years went by, I had nightmares about that house, and still do. It's always the same dream. I'd be staring into a very dark corner of the old house. It was the attic floor, and I could feel something violent in there. Something that wanted to hurt me. But as soon as it was about to reach its arms for me, I would wake up, sweating and terrified. I have also dreamt that this dark entity was going to enter my body or my family members' bodies. One time I dreamt that the thing went into my cousin's body, and shortly afterward, she began to suffer from anorexia. Another time, the creature tried to enter me, but instead went to my aunt. Shortly after that dream, my aunt had a hurtful breakup with one man she had been with for many years, and she fell into a depression. If I ever mention the creature aloud, I will have bad dreams afterward. It's like it's still trying to get me. My mother and I were talking about these events a few months ago, and she wanted to tell me something she didn't dare do before. When we lived in the house, she invited a medium to see what was going on. My dad was a skeptic, so she did it in secret while he was on a business trip. Me and my brother were at school, so we couldn't have known. The medium was talking lightly about some spirits that were looking over my mother, when she suddenly stopped. My mother said she became pale and said, "Your daughter, she has a lot of problems with this place, no?" My mother nodded, a bit surprised with the medium's sudden interpretation. "There is a spirit here that truly loves your daughter, and there is something, well, that doesn't." At this moment, my mother became very frightened, because she knew about the events that terrorized me every night. So, she asked who it was and why the spirit was doing it only to me. The medium became quiet at one point and said that she was unable to get in contact with the other entity in the house. The next thing she said gave me chills all throughout my body. "This is not a spirit. What is haunting this place is a mass of dark energies. Many bad events have passed on these grounds that this house stands on. A lot of death, fear, sickness, and anger. And when it becomes too much, all these dark energies can manifest and become a dark force, something like a demon. I choked. My mother said she became so scared she didn't want to hear more, and she told no one about the medium's visit. After that, I started to do some research of my old village, and it turned out to be older than I expected. It went all the way back to the times of the Vikings. On the spot where the house stands, a lot of dead bodies were found, some from the war during the time of the Vikings, and some were corpses from the Black Plague. I truly believe the whole village is haunted. Both my friends and my parents' friends who have lived there, and some who are still living there, have their own stories to tell about weird experiences. And I had experiences at my friends' houses as well. But our house was known to be the worst. And I can truly agree with that. And this is a story from Julie in Tennessee. Shadow Boy. When I was in elementary school, I was playing in the woods adjacent to our house. Along with me were my dog and my dog's friend. That is to say, our neighbor's dog. The two were thick as thieves. I'd played in these woods as long as I could remember. Where I lived was a very safe suburban neighborhood in the 1980s, so me being by myself with my mom and sister was not unheard of. I recall looking back toward my yard and the house from the trail to the woods. The trees must have been in early bloom, because my visibility was still pretty clear. I remember my dog and the neighbor's dog running off deeper into the woods after something. They went far enough that I couldn't hear them rustling in the branches and undergrowth. I remember distinctly seeing them run off and looking in the direction away from the path entryway. I decided to go deeper into the woods. I'm not 100% what I was doing that day. Most likely I was being an adventuring kid. I remember vividly a wind blowing past my ear and hearing very clearly my name, Laura. I turned around startled, thinking maybe, just maybe, it was my sister. And then I saw a little boy shadow figure run across the path that led to my house. I was stunned. The wind picked up, and the energy of the woods became more electric. The little figure that I assumed was a boy was a 3D form, arms, legs, head, body, visible, but nothing else. All black and shadowy. It was about my size. The hair, or whatever, seemed short. Thus I assumed it was a boy. It also seemed to me to be a male. I was speechless, and my first instinct was to call for my dog. My dog and the neighbor's dog came bursting through the woods, and everything felt like it went back to normal suddenly. Suffice it to say, I got out of there as soon as I was able to muster the strength. When I cleared the woods and got into our yard, I remember my sister popping her head up on our deck. She was telling me that it was dinner time. I went inside the house, shell-shocked. My mom, being a good mom, tried to convince me that it was my overactive imagination. But she has since recanted that now that I'm in my 30s, and has expressed some experiences of her own in the house. While those experiences weren't like mine, they were still very much unexplainable. Here's a story from Jaelly in Ogden, Utah. Her name was Ella. My son has had many imaginary friends over the years. None of them ever lasted long, and he rarely talks much about them. It has never bothered me or worried me. I love hearing about the paranormal, and have never experienced anything myself. My son was diagnosed with autism at the age of 4, so I just assumed it was his overactive or emotional imagination. When he was 2, my sister-in-law, unfortunately, had a baby girl who passed away right after she was born. They named the girl Ella, and she was buried about 2 blocks from my house. My sister-in-law didn't have much money, so sadly there was only a temporary grave marker for Ella. We decided not to tell our son about it, and never talked about it again, mainly out of respect for my sister-in-law, who didn't like bringing it up. A few months ago, my son, now 11, came to me crying. He seemed to be sad, and it was hard for me to calm him down. He just kept saying how sad the little girl was, and asked me to help her. I asked him what little girl. He said there was a little girl in our backyard by the tree who was crying. He had talked to her and asked her what was wrong. She told him that her family had forgotten all about her and she was lonely. My son then told me that he invited her to live in his room and begged me to say it was okay. He just could not leave her alone. I looked outside and back to his room. There was no little girl. I hugged him, trying to console him, and I asked him if he knew her name. He said her name was Ella. And he said that we are her family. I swallowed hard as my eyes started to water. I promised him that I would do what I could for her. My husband and I have since ordered a grave marker and have visited her at the cemetery. I don't know if it was truly our little niece, or if what we had done will put her to rest. I guess we will see in the near future if my son's new friend, Ella, will stay or not. And this is a story from Evan, and he's in the U.S., and he's going to tell you a story about the ghost dog at Grandma's house.
Hey Lex, my name's Patrick. I'm here with my son Evan. He's 7 years old and he's a big fan of your show. He'd like to share a story with you today, so go ahead and let him tell you about the ghost dog at his grandmother's house.
Well, one day, I was at my grandma's house. We were about to eat dinner, and I was in the basement, and then I walked upstairs, and I was going to get one of my toys out of my dad's car, and when I was going out there, I saw a little white thing, and I recognized it was in the shape of a dog, and it was moving around and jumping, and it was a white figure dog.
But the really weird part about that is his grandmother doesn't have a white dog, right?
She used to have a cat.
But she doesn't anymore either.
No. And when I went in the truck to get the dog, I trapped myself in there on purpose, and then I quickly got out the other side, and I ran inside, and I tripped, and I fell, and that's the end.
All right, well, thanks for listening to Evan's ghost story today. I know it doesn't sound real creepy, but if you saw a white ghost dog at your grandmother's house, you'd probably be freaked out too. So, like I said, we're big fans. Hopefully we'll hear ourselves on the show. Thanks. Bye.
Okay, thanks, Evan, and I hope you enjoyed the stickers that I sent. The next story is from Paula in Garland, Texas. Swimming pool ghost. This is a true ghost experience I had as a young preteen girl growing up and babysitting various little kids over my early years. I did not know the couple very well that I was babysitting for, because they were neighbors to some of my friends with whom I attended church. In fact, that was the first time I had babysat for them. The husband was a doctor, and his wife was a stay-at-home mom. They were very nice. Their home was 3 levels and backed up to a creek called Duck Creek. There was a pool in their backyard, and the bottom level of the house was a solid glass wall of windows overlooking their beautiful backyard and pool area. They had 2 small children, a girl and a boy. They were old enough to dress themselves and follow directions, and were able to swim alone. That night I watched them swim a little while, and after dark we went inside through a mudroom where I had to leave their wet suits on the dryer. They had wrapped themselves in their towels and ran upstairs to the 3rd level to change into their pajamas. I had asked them to bring their wet towels back down to me so I could hang them to dry in the mudroom. I went inside behind them and was going up to the 2nd level, which was the main level of the house, where the kitchen and living room were located, and I went into the bathroom to dry their hair. After entering the bathroom, I told them I would be right back as I ran the wet towels back down to the mudroom. When I got down to the bottom level, I glanced outside through the huge wall of windows and noticed the swimming pool was splashing around like someone was in the pool. Startled and scared that one of the kids had gone back outside, I scrambled out to the pool. But when I went out the door, there was no one in the pool. But there were clearly wet splashes of water all around the pool. It was like whoever was swimming had just gotten out of the pool and circled, soaking wet, and made the concrete darker with water circles. But the pool was calm. Figuring it was a fluke, or maybe the pool vacuum had circled in the water, I blew it off and went back inside the mudroom door. When I entered, I found the clothes dryer on, and it sounded like there were shoes inside of it, making a very loud pounding sound. I thought the kids had come down and put their towels in the dryer for me. I went back upstairs to the main floor and found the kids were in the kitchen eating a snack. I took them into the bathroom to dry their hair, but as we entered the doorway, the hairdryer started by itself. I grabbed it quickly, only to realize that the hairdryer was not plugged in. I dropped the dryer and grabbed both of the kids and went into the formal living area. We got on the couch. They eventually fell asleep on either side of me in that room, but we didn't move until their parents came home. The mom was confused and asked why we were on the couch, as it was rather late and after the kids' bedtime. She could see the fear in my eyes and immediately asked me what had happened. I explained everything. She turned to her husband and said, "I told you things were happening in this house. We are moving." Very shortly after this, they put their home on the market. Years and years later, my daughters and I were visiting a swimming pool with our friends and their kids, and they all begged me to tell this story to our friends. I warned them that it was very spooky, and I asked my friend if she thought it would be too scary for her kids. She insisted that I tell them. As we were driving home, they all asked if we could drive by and see the house, so I agreed, and we drove to the place where the house was. There, we saw a brand new house under construction in that exact spot. and that freaked me out even more. A story from Joe in Hart, Michigan. The woman specter in our home. This is a 3-part story that takes place in different times, but only one of the stories actually happened to me. I'll go in chronological order. About 10 or 11 years ago, we used to have a lot of family gatherings at our house. Whether it was for holiday or birthdays, we always had something going on at the end of the week or weekends. This was like any other weekend. We had the whole family and quite a few other people over. Aunts, uncles, cousins, grandma, and great-grandma, who this story is about. Toward the end of our gathering, my mom noticed my great-grandma was down and would not talk to my mom. No one knew why, until my grandma decided to ask her what was wrong. She kept looking over at my mom and back to my grandma. She did that quite a few times, before finally telling everyone what was wrong. She said she had gone to the bathroom, but that on her way back, she peeked into the room that was next to the bathroom, and in the back corner of the dark room, she saw my mom standing there. But she couldn't see her face, because her long dark hair was covering it. She said that she called out and said hi, but my mom would not answer. My mom said that she had never been in that room that night. She had been in the living room with everyone. The second story involves my uncle. We live on property that my grandpa bought a long time ago. One of my uncles, along with his family and my grandma, live on this property, in different homes, of course. My Uncle Rudy came to visit his brothers one day. He stopped by at my Uncle Roger's home first, then came to our home. When he got here, he looked at my mom with a surprised look on his face. He asked, "How did you get over here so fast?" My mom, confused, asked what he meant, because she had been home the whole time. My Uncle Rudy went on and said that while he was at my Uncle Roger's house talking to him outside, he saw her sitting on their couch. My mom swears that she was home and that the woman he saw was not her. This last story is one that happened to me about 3 years ago. I used to go out to parties a lot, not to drink or anything, but to dance. So I'd usually get home a little late. My parents didn't mind. They knew they could trust I wouldn't do anything dumb. Well, it was just another weekend for me. I had just gotten home. It was about 2 a.m., and I figured everyone would be asleep already. But as I pulled into my driveway, I saw that the kitchen light was on. In the kitchen, I saw my dad, having a snack and drinking a beer, since he had just gotten home from a party as well. I then noticed that standing behind him was my mom. I figured she was heating something in the microwave. I parked my car, got my stuff, and went inside. I walked in and greeted my dad. My mom wasn't there, and I assumed she had gone into another room, so I sat down with my dad and chatted with him. Suddenly, my mom came in from outside. Without really thinking, I asked where she was. She told me that she was next door. "Oh, did you go through the back door when I got here?" I asked. "No," she replied. "I was at your grandma's when you got here. I watched you pull in." It's been a few years, and I haven't experienced the woman since. Neither has anyone else, as far as I know. Or at least not that I've heard of.
Hi Lex, this is Annie calling from Vineland, New Jersey, and I've sent a few stories into you before. Now, I've been listening to the show for 7 or 8 years now, so I know the drill. There's supposed to be stories of things that actually happened to you, but I've told you my few stories. So, however, I'm a house painter, and I listen to the podcast while I'm working, and every now and then one of my clients will hear when I'm listening to and wonder what on earth it is. And so we get started talking about ghost stories. So a few of them had stories that they told me, and they gave me permission to send them in to you. So here's a few stories from southern New Jersey for you. The first story is from my clients. Their names are Harry and Sandy, and they've been in their current house since the end of 2009. But before that, the house that they lived in, I think they moved in 1982, and it was 15 or 20 years old when they bought it. And they said there was only one previous owner, and she knows nobody died in the house. The only thing that was strange at first, their dining room opens directly into the foyer. There's a big doorway into the foyer. And every once in a while, when Sandy was in the dining room, out of the corner of her eye, she would see a man coming down the stairs. And when she looked, there was nobody there. That was it, just someone coming down the stairs. She didn't have any description of him. She just knew it was a man, and nothing else happened. But it happened several times while they were living there. Now, the next thing that happened was one year at Christmas, their heater died on Christmas Eve. And it was really cold out, obviously, and they were very lucky that they were able to find somebody to come out on Christmas Eve and repair it. Next year, on Christmas Eve, the heater died again. And again, they were very lucky to get somebody to come out and repair it again. Third year, on Christmas Day, they were having dinner, and it was Harry and Sandy and their daughter and Harry's mother, and the four of them were in the middle of dinner at the dining room table, and they were talking about the heater dying the last 2 years. And Harry said, well, at least nothing's happened this year. And no sooner were the words out of his mouth, but the chandelier above the table came crashing down onto the table. And it was one of those Tiffany lamps, so it's panels of stained glass held together with a metal frame. And so luckily it wasn't something that shattered into a million pieces. It was a couple of the panels broke, but that was it. Thankfully, nobody was hurt, which is a miracle. And of course, they were all shaken, but they all just said, well, we're just not going to talk about that anymore, and change the subject, and that was that. I don't know where this part fits into the story, but at some point in the 26, 27 years that they lived there, Sandy was asleep on the sofa. Now, the family room and the kitchen are one long room, and I think it was just separated by, there was like a couple steps down into the family room. But if anything happened in the kitchen, obviously you would hear or see it from the family room. So one night, Sandy fell asleep on the sofa in the family room, and she woke up in the middle of the night. Nothing woke her up. She just woke up and went into the kitchen to get a drink of water. And the kitchen sink was filled halfway up with broken glass. And she has no idea where it came from. The windows were fine. The lights were all fine. There were no broken glasses. But if anything had broken, or even if somebody had just poured all that glass into the sink, she would have heard it. She was only 15, 20 feet away. Obviously, she would have heard it. And the really strange part about it, she actually saved a piece of this glass, and she showed it to me because it was just such a weird situation. The glass was 1/4 inch, maybe a 1/2 inch thick. This was not from drinking glasses. It wasn't even from modern windows or lights or anything. It was thick glass, and it was kind of scratched and worn and wasn't even really crystal clear. It looked like it had been outside or something. The way it broke into pieces that are about 1 inch, 2 inch squares, not perfect squares or anything, but just really small pieces. The really strange thing about it, though, is you could not cut yourself on this if you tried. They were not broken into even pieces, but I tried to cut myself with it, and you absolutely couldn't cut yourself. To the point she actually scooped all of the glass out of the sink with her bare hands and throw it into the trash, and didn't cut herself once. And the next morning, she showed her husband and said, "What the heck is this?" And he had no idea what it was, where it came from, how it got there. And to this day, they have no idea where that came from. They never found any place missing glass. So really, really strange mystery. But she thought it was strange too because it was the second thing that involved glass. The first being the chandelier breaking, falling on the table, which it didn't break into a million pieces, thankfully. And then, later this glass showing up in this thing. So really weird. No idea where that came from. That was pretty much it for years. And like I said, in 2009, they moved to a house on the other side of town and just, downsizing, bought a smaller house. The last day that they owned the old house, Sandy stayed in the new house, but they were building a fence in the backyard because they had dogs, and the fence wasn't finished yet. So Harry had to stay in the old house with the dogs that night. And I think he just had, the whole house was empty. I think he just had a sleeping bag on the floor, poor guy. That night, he spoke out loud to the house before he went to bed, and he said, "Well, we're moving tomorrow, and we know you've been here with us all these years, and you've never caused any trouble or anything, so if you want to come with us to the new house, you're welcome." And that was it. He went to sleep. Nothing happened. The next day, brought the last stuff to the new house, and he told Sandy what he had told the ghost. And she said, "Well, what did you tell him that for? Don't tell him that." So they had a laugh about it, and that was that. They were busy getting the house ready and all that. So that night was the first night that they spent in their new house, and everything was fine. And then they went to bed, and at 3 o'clock in the morning on the dot, the doorbell rang. So Harry races to the door to open it, and there's nobody there. So Sandy said, "Well, I guess you let the ghost in." And again, they kind of laughed about it, but that was that. And nothing has happened in that house, the new house, ever since. Except they get rescue dogs, and who knows what happened to these dogs before they owned it. So they have this one dog that's really hyper and can't sit still for 2 seconds, except every night he will stare at this spot on the ceiling. And he's a pointer, so he actually sits there with his tail sticking straight out, and he will not move for a good 20 minutes. You can wave your hand in front of his face and he will not move. But I tell you, I saw that dog do that one time, and I was like, that is creepy. But I think that's pretty much everything that happened in that house. Still no idea who the ghost was. That was that. So my second story, my client named Karen, they had a house that they had recently built, and I was working over there, and her younger son was complaining that he was afraid to sleep in his bedroom because he was afraid of ghosts. So Karen said to him, "Well, maybe if you didn't watch ghost shows on TV, you wouldn't be afraid of ghosts." So I said, "Oh, honey, this is a new house. You guys are the first owners. Nobody ever died in this house. There couldn't possibly be ghosts in this house." So he said, "Okay," and he left the room. And I turned to Karen and said, "Actually, there totally could be, but I'm not going to tell him that." And she said, "I know, but our last house was haunted, and I did everything I could to make sure that this one's not haunted." So I said, "Oh, you got to tell me what happened." Now, our town is, Vineland is, I believe, the biggest town in New Jersey area-wise, and that's because of all the farms. And it's over 150 years old, and it started out all these farms that were run by mostly Italians who had grapevines to make wine, hence the name Vineland. So back then, who knows where the nearest hospital was. I'm guessing a lot of people died at home. So the house that they had originally lived in, and this was in 1995, and the house was 110 years old at the time, and it was a farmhouse. So a lot of things happened in that house. There were antiques in the attic. that had been there when they moved in, and they just left them up there. And Karen said she would hear footsteps up in the attic when she knew there was nobody home. The only antique that she did bring downstairs was a mirror that she hung on the wall. So who knows if her bringing that downstairs caused anything, or if it was just everything in the house. But she said whatever it was that was in the house would play with her dog. They had a black lab named Paula, and she would just bark and bark and bark. And they said she would run in circles and stare at this one spot on the wall and just bark like crazy. And then she'd stop and look at them like, hello, are you going to do something about this? And they didn't see anything. And one time, Karen was upstairs, and Nala was barking downstairs, and she could not get the dog to stop barking as she was just going crazy. So finally Karen came downstairs, and the front door, which had been double bolted, locked, was wide open, and the coat rack was standing in the middle of the foyer. And Karen said, "Not funny, knock it off." And then she sat down on the stairs and started crying because she was scared, you know? And she was pregnant at the time. She didn't have time for this stuff. That stopped for a while, and then the bathtub would turn on in the middle of the night. And finally, the third time that happened, her husband had a few choice words for it, and that stopped. So you don't mess with the man of the house, I guess. So I think that is everything that happened in that house. Now, when they moved to the new house, she went to see a psychic with a friend, and the psychic brought up the house to her and said, the house with the chicken feathers has a presence that needs to go to the other side, and it doesn't want to go. Well, of course, the chicken feathers was a farmhouse, and there was a chicken coop in the back. So, and she said the presence used to play with your dog, which we know that he did. So she said, make sure and smudge your new house so that it couldn't come in with anything that you brought over with it. And she said she didn't feel like there was anything in the new house, but just to be safe, she smudged the house anyway. And she's fairly sensitive to spirits, but she has a friend who's very sensitive, and she said this girl can't even go into antique stores, and sometimes she'll be in places and just say, you know, the energy's bad, we need to get out of here. So if she's been in the new house and she's felt everything is fine, then apparently all is well with that house. So the last story that I have is just a short one, but it's about a Ouija board, and who doesn't love a good Ouija board story? And one of my clients' name was Josh, said when he was a kid, he and his siblings would play with the Ouija board, and we did too in my family. So one year, I think he said it was Easter or something, some holiday. After dinner, all of the kids, the cousins and siblings and everybody, got the Ouija board out, and we're playing with it on the dining room table. And so they contacted something, and they were talking to it and said, you know, can you give us a sign that you're here? And it spelled out MARGARET. And when it got to the letter T, his sister Margaret, who was in the next room in the kitchen washing the dishes, screamed. And she said for no reason, a glass jumped out of her hand and broke and cut her hand right when the Ouija board spelled out her name. So they put away the Ouija board, and that was it for the night. So I guess that's about it. Like I said, my family, our kids used to play with the Ouija board all the time, and my grandmother was very Catholic, so I guess it didn't bother her, but we always used to swear that one of my aunts, and I don't know if I'm remembering this wrong or if this was just a family legend, but we always used to swear then when my one aunt would enter the room, the planchette would just fly off the board every time. So I don't know what that one means, but and like I said, it might just be kids making that stuff up, but that's the way that goes. So anyway, that's a few stories from southern New Jersey for you guys. Hope you enjoyed them, and if anything happens to me in one of my clients' houses, I'll let you know. So other than that, have a good one, guys. Talk to you later. Bye.
If you're enjoying Anything Ghost, and you've blown through those 10 free episodes that are available to you, maybe it's time to take a look at the Anything Ghost VIP group. There's a one-time membership fee, and this will give you access to the complete Anything Ghost archives dating back over 10 years, actually 11 years now. That's thousands of creepy paranormal experiences like the ones you're hearing in this episode. Plus, you get access to an early release for each new episode, and there are other extras as well. Complete your Anything Ghost library. Go to anythingghost.com and click on the VIP group link for more information. Now accepting major credit cards along with PayPal. www.anythingghost.com, the VIP group link for more information. And Steve from Greenville, South Carolina, is going to tell us about their dog companions. And he calls it Their Heaven is With Us. I'm writing about this just 6 hours after my most recent paranormal event. First, I must give you a little backstory. When I first met my wife, Anita, she introduced me to Georgia and Holly. Georgia, a Siberian husky, was rescued from a national forest. Someone threw her away, leaving her to survive on her own or die. It never ceases to amaze me how cruel and ignorant some people can be. She survived because a fish hatchery nearby provided her with food and water. When Anita found her on a hiking trip, the husky she named Georgia looked like she was ready to give up. She was filthy and covered with ticks and fleas. Anita rescued her with the approval of the Parks Ranger's office, then took her to the vet, and she paid a great deal of money for heartworm treatments, vaccines, and care she needed. She was just over 1 year old, per the vet's estimate. With Anita and myself, I came along a couple years later. Georgia had a loving home for many years, as did Holly. Holly, a beautiful golden retriever, was gotten when Anita was still with her ex-husband. They got her as a young pup. He insisted on having her when they split. He gave her a good home. However, shortly after Anita rescued Georgia, her ex asked Anita to take Holly. She did. When Anita and I started dating, she saw her dogs approved of me. Anyone who didn't pass the approval test wouldn't have a chance with her. I passed with flying colors. We dated, then lived together for years before we finally got married. The dogs were our only children. Many years later, the dogs got old. Holly went first. One morning, she couldn't even stand anymore. The doctor said it was most likely cancer. He assured us that suffering had not come yet, but would very soon. Since she was over 15 years old, we decided it was not in her interest to prolong her life, which wouldn't have been much longer anyway. We could not stand to see her suffer. So, at the conservative vet's recommendation, we decided to let her pass with dignity. It was the toughest act of love that I've ever experienced. I held her and petted her, while she gently and peacefully drifted away. Georgia was next to go. She was the same as Holly a couple of years later, after Cushing's disease had reached its final stage. She was 13 years old. Their ashes are on a bookcase. Pictures of them are placed upon the urns that hold their remains. We have another rescued dog now. Her name is Molly. We got her when she was just a few months old. Her and her mother were turned over to the shelter and rescued by Foothills Golden Retriever Rescue Group. She is our joy, and we love her just as much as we did Georgia and Holly. Sometimes Molly appears to be watching or following someone or something around the house. On many occasions, Anita and myself will see a dog from the corner of our eye quickly move by, then vanish. We will walk upstairs and find Molly asleep in her bed. Sometimes we will see or hear a dog upstairs and find Molly downstairs asleep on the couch. Sometimes we will hear paws jumping on the bed all the way from downstairs. I have heard this happen while Anita was out on a walk with Molly. These occurrences have gone on for years now since their passing. Molly has developed some of their old habits. On March 20th, 2017, at 3 a.m. exactly, I was awakened to the sound of Molly jumping on our bed. Molly always sleeps with us, and it isn't unusual at all for her to get up several times during the night. I could hear the dog turning in a circle, and the mattress move with the movement of her paws and the shifting of her weight as she settled down. I felt her nuzzle against the back of my legs. "Molly Moo, go sleepy time," I said. I got up to get a glass of water downstairs, and lying on the tiled floor by the front door, by the base of the staircase, was Molly. She was sound asleep. I turned around to examine the bed and saw the imprint of where a dog had just been lying. I feel certain that Georgia and Holly are here with us. We can feel their energy throughout the modest home. We can tell Molly knows of their presence as well. Maybe their heaven is here with us, at least for now. This is the little home where so much love is shared between us, and I'd like to think that a place of love is what heaven is. I only hope when we move on, that the dogs we shared our love with join us there. The next story is from Paula in the U.S. Family Ghost. One night in December of 2015, I was sitting alone in my living room on my sofa. I was watching a movie on my phone. All my kids were asleep in their rooms. My sofa faces my dining room and kitchen with a wall in the middle. On the left is a big window and wall where I hang religious items. I was watching a movie, and suddenly I saw a white figure like a human come out of the wall where I hang those religious items, and it walked across the dining room and disappeared behind the wall that was between my kitchen and dining room. I didn't think anything of it and wasn't scared. My son had been sick for 2 days with a high fever and vomiting, and not getting better. 2 days later, my daughter got sick, too. I wasn't too concerned. I just thought it was a cold or a flu. A few days before I got sick, I was lying in my bed. My husband works nights. And I was lying on my left side. I could see down the hallway into the living room. All the lights were out, but we like to turn the dim light in the hallway anyway. I was lying in my bed and watching a movie on my phone again. Then, I saw a white figure, like the other one, walk across the hall from the left and disappear into the kitchen again. Again, I wasn't scared. But the next day, I was sick. So, all 3 of us were sick. I called my aunt, who has a sister that was a shaman. She told me that the reason I was seeing the white figure was that it was someone in my family visiting, because my son and daughter were sick. My father-in-law had just passed away 1 month prior, and she said it was probably him visiting. She told me to tell him that we knew he was still with us, and ask him to make your children better. No matter what I did, my son and daughter were not getting any better. I thought about it, and remembered when I was crying in November about my father-in-law. Then I went over to my son, who was running a high fever of 102 degrees and vomiting. I knelt beside my son and prayed. While there, I felt something caressing my head. The caressing seemed to be telling me it would be okay. At that point, I asked my father-in-law if that was him there, if he would please do something to make his grandson and granddaughter better. I went back to lie down. Within 30 minutes, my daughter called out to me. I thought something had happened, so I ran into their room. My daughter pointed out that my son was sweating a lot. I looked at him, took his temperature. It had gone all the way to normal, and he wasn't even hot anymore. His fever was gone. He slept all night and was all better the next day. This story is from Emilee in Illinois, U.S. Ogden, Illinois summer camp. During the summer, when I was in middle school, I would stay at a dude ranch in Ogden, Illinois. They would split the boys and girls into separate dorms. There were big rooms upstairs above the mess hall. The rooms were on different sides of the building, with different staircases that led up to them. The year I'm talking about here, the girls were in the room on the left side of the building, with the windows that faced the house on the edge of the property. The house was part of the land's original property. It was where the family that originally owned the land, before it was converted into a summer camp, used to live. The house was supposedly haunted. Some of the camp counselors who lived there would tell us stories about how the electricity would turn itself on and off, and how doors would close by themselves. It was spooky, but not as scary as the graveyard that worked as the home's backyard. We were told campfire stories about the family that used to live there. One of the stories was that one of the graves belonged to a woman who had lost many children to pneumonia. She supposedly got hit by a train and survived when she was on her way to get help for her last child, when she heard it coughing. She'd been frantic, and when she woke up at the hospital, she wouldn't stop calling out for her baby, of whom no one could find. And her husband denied there was ever a baby. He committed her to an asylum, where she eventually died. I never knew if the story was true, but I definitely think that house and the land near it was haunted. One day I was sitting in the girls' dorm with friends that I had made, and we were playing with our disposable cameras. I kept looking through the lens one way, and then the other, flipping it front and back, watching as they zoomed in and out of focus. I had just started to pull the camera away from my face when I saw black smoke coming from the window closest to the house outside. It all happened very fast. Before I could really focus, the smoke was gone, and instead, a woman was standing behind one of my friends. She didn't really look right. She seemed older, maybe in her late 40s or 50s. It was hard to tell. She wore her hair tight to her head, pulled back in a bun, and had on a floor-length dress. What bothered me about her, though, were her eyes. There were no whites and no color. They were all black and leaked that dark smoke I'd seen before. So did the crease of her smile. One of her hands was curled around my friend's shoulder, and it really bothered me. I blinked, and the older woman was gone. So was any smoke. Afterwards, I asked my friends if they had felt anything or gotten cold, but she told me no. I'm almost done with college now, but that experience still weirds me out. A story from Lucy in Houston, Texas. Krum House.
The stories I have to tell all happened in this old frame house that I lived in the early 2000s in Krum, Texas, about 45 miles north of Dallas. I lived there for about a year and a half, and immediately upon moving in, there were certain areas of the house that I felt unsettled in. So one of the things that happened was that a friend of mine had come over, and we were sitting in my bedroom, and my friend had left to go to the restroom, and I had thought of something that I wanted to show her that I knew was in a box. And so while she was in the bathroom, I was going to go get it out and show it to her. And so I went over, and I was knelt down on the ground, and then I felt the sensation of like a finger or a hand gliding up my spine. And so I thought it was my friend, sort of just poking fun at me because my shirt was up. And I said, oh, that's really cute. That's funny. And then I heard my friend's voice from the door say, oh, what was funny? And I turned around, and my friend was way too far away to have been the one to have touched my back. And, the house had hardwood floors. And so she had done it and ran back to the doorway to get there so quickly before I had a chance to turn around. I would have heard her running back, and I didn't. And then the last story of what I can remember that had happened in that house, there was another story that was just kind of funny, but it was involving a dream, and I don't really think it had anything to do with anything supernatural. It was just it was kind of it was scary at first, but then it turned out funny in the end. But the last story of something that I couldn't explain was I was working full time. I was in my early 30s at the time, and I was going to school on the weekends, working on my degree, class at a time. And so I was at home, studying all day on a Saturday. So it was in the middle of the day, and I was studying, and I had put some just like a cooking sheet in the oven to cook me something for lunch. And so I heated it up, turned it on, and timed it, went back in and studied. And then when it was time to go check on it, I went in and checked on it, and it was just about done. So I turned off the oven and but left the food in there so that it could just finish cooking. And thought, that I would go in there after I finished whatever chapter I was working on, or whatever the case was. And so I was sitting there, and the house is very quiet. It's just me, and I'm not listening to music or anything. The oven, doing the little tick noise that it does when it goes to kick on. And I thought I turned off the oven. And so I jump up because I think, the food was almost done. And if I didn't turn the oven off, then the food's going to burn. So I jump up and I go in there, and sure enough, the oven's on. So I turned it off. And at this point, the food's ready. So I take it off and put it on top of the oven to let it cool down a little bit before I eat it. And I sit back down. And I'm working again. And then I hear it again. The tick. And I thought, oh my gosh. Okay, I know I turned the oven off this time because I made such a point of it. So I get up, go in the kitchen, and sure enough, the oven's back on again. And now, this isn't, it's not an electric, fancy electric range. It's just the old school, when you want to turn the oven on, you turn the dial. So it's not as if a short could have turned it back on. So I turn the oven off again for the third time, and I pick up the phone in the kitchen, because this is before cell phones. I pick up the phone in the kitchen, I call a friend of mine, and, and I'm busy, I have work to do, but this is just really freaking me out, and I know that if I tell anybody, no one's going to believe me that this happened. And, and I sort of, part of me thinks that I might just be crazy, thinking that I've turned it off, twice already, and really I hadn't. And so I just call my friend, and she says, hey, what are you doing? I thought you were studying. And I said, I am. But listen, don't ask any questions. Just, I'm going to tell you something, okay? And she said, okay. And I said, I'm turning my oven off right now. Okay? And she said, okay. And I said, click, turn it off. Did you hear it? Because you know how when you turn it, the old ones, it would kind of do a little, that pop. She said, yes, I heard it. What's going on? I'm like, don't worry about it. I'll tell you next time we hang out. So we hang up, and I go back out, and I do some more homework. Sure enough, I hear it clicking again. And I'm like, okay, now I know that I've turned it off. I have, I have proof. I have a witness of sorts. And it's not me. I'm not crazy. I walk into the kitchen and sure as heck, that thing was turned back on. And, I'm a little scared, but really more than anything else, I'm frustrated because I have a lot of work to do and I have a very limited amount of time to do it. And all of this is just taking way too much time out of my leisure. And so it was irritating me. And so I turned the oven off and I turn around and I just say, look. And for some reason, it just popped into my head that it was this woman. And, in my imagination, it's this woman, dressed like, with the apron on, just like someone from the 50s or something. And, the house was probably built during that time. But I just turn around, and I get this picture in my head and I say, look, ma'am, I know that this is your home. I respect that it's your home. But I'm trying to do my homework in the other room. And what you're doing right now is really distracting me and it's kind of freaking me out. So if you could just hold off and do your cooking after I finish studying, I would really appreciate that. And then I just turn around and go back out and do my homework. And actually, on my way, I put my food on the plate because at this time it's cooled off and I'm hungry, which is why I was cooking something to eat. And it didn't come on again after that. So I don't know. I know what happened. I know that I had to turn that oven off, 3 times before it stayed off. And I know that it stopped after I said what I said. So take that to mean whatever you will. So those are my stories. I have some other stories that I will send in at a later date. I don't know if I'll narrate them again myself or if I'll type them up for Lex to read because I really want to hear Lex read my stories in his wonderful voice. So take care.
A story from Emilee in the UK. Hospital Ghost Stories. I work as a diagnostic radiographer at a small district general hospital, producing X-ray images to aid doctors with their diagnosis. In the time since I qualified 3 years ago, I've worked in a number of different hospitals, including a former workhouse. But it is my current hospital, a fairly modern building, that has the most stories attached to it. It is quite common among healthcare professionals, especially when working night shifts, to share spooky stories of the things we have experienced. Almost everyone in our department has seen something, and I want to share some of these with you. The first happened to a colleague of mine. He had been working a night shift, and heavy snow had fallen during the night. Because of the snow, only a handful of staff had made it in to relieve him. Knowing the snowfall was quite bad, and that it would be a struggle for him to make it safely home and back again for his shift, he decided to stay at the hospital. As there wasn't enough staff to run all the X-ray rooms, they made the perfect place to sleep. He chose one room, switched off the lights, and slept on the examination table. At some point during the night, he awoke to a firm pressure from a hand on his shoulder. He opened his eyes. He couldn't see anyone there. Also, the door to the X-ray room was not open. X-ray rooms achieve almost total darkness when the lights are off, as a throwback to the days of film imaging, when even the tiniest bit of light was a risk to the image quality. So had anyone opened the door and entered or exited from the brightly lit corridor, he would have noticed. A little frightened, he tried to convince himself that all he felt was the sleeve of his jacket that he was using as a blanket, brushing his shoulder as he moved in his sleep. He pushed the incident from his mind and went back to sleep. The second story took place in one of our CT rooms. All plain X-ray radiographers are required to complete CT head scans outside the normal working hours. This helps reduce wait time for patients with life-threatening situations. That night I was working a night shift and helping a patient from an accident and emergency onto the scan table. In the room were myself, the patient, and the nurse who had accompanied the patient. The other radiographer who was working the shift with me was holding down the fort in the main department. Looking up out of the corner of my eye, I caught the sight of something blue moving across the control room. It appeared to sit down at the controls. Great, I thought. My colleague has come around to help. In our department, we all wear dark blue uniforms, so I just assumed it was she. Glad that we could get the scan done quicker, I finished setting up and went with the nurse into the control room, only to find the room was empty. Confused, I completed the scan and returned to the main department, where I found my colleague x-raying a patient. When she finished, I asked her if she had been into the CT room. She said she hadn't. A little creeped out, I explained what had happened, and she agreed that it was weird. But in the end, we decided it was probably just my eyes playing tricks on me. It was late after all. Sometime later, and then back on the day shift, I walked into a conversation some of my colleagues were having about their own ghostly sightings. I overheard a radiographer, who used to work full-time in CT, telling a story almost identical to my own. She had been working late one night and had seen a blue figure walk past the control room window. She thought it was a colleague of hers until she called out and there was no one in the room. There are many experiences in that department that are creepy and have an oppressive feel, but for some reason that CT room has the most experiences. Last week I was working a set of night shifts and was waiting in the scan room for a patient. I heard noises and figured that they had arrived, but when I opened the doors to let them in, I only saw the nurse and the porter, and they were having a loud discussion about the door that had just slammed shut on them. The door in question was one of those that clicks into a catch and stays open. No one had touched the door when it released from the catch and started to close, which isn't uncommon after a length of time. What is odd, though, is that it's also a safety door, one of those doors that only closes gently and slowly. Even when exerting force, it's difficult to shut it quickly, so it should not have been able to slam like that. The nurse was quite disturbed, and when I told her what I had seen, she started asking questions. Working in a hospital, even in a department like ours, where patients only briefly pass through, death is unfortunately never far away. There have been several sad occasions of patients that have died during our examinations. However, what the nurse wanted to know was if any of the staff from our department had died. I thought back and told her that before I started working there, a member of the staff had sadly died. I told her how much it had devastated the department. It was a connection I had never made before, but now it makes me wonder. A story from Katelyn in Washington, D.C.
Hey Lex, I want to start by saying that I love your show. I've been listening for a long time, and thank you so much for giving us all a forum on which to share our scary stories. I've kind of gone back and forth about sending this in to you for quite a while, and I think that's because I'm not 100% positive that this was a ghost. Actually, when it first happened, I immediately thought that it was extraterrestrial, more so than paranormal. But regardless of what it was, it is the most scared that I've ever been, and I'm still unable to explain it all these years later. This happened to me about a decade or so ago when I was like a junior in college, maybe. I went to a small East Coast university for undergrad, and it was kind of out in the country, but pretty close to larger cities. And it was November, so it was the time of year when it's like pitch black outside, even though it's not that late. And this was like 6 p.m., so not too late, but still really dark out already. And I was driving back to school from visiting my boyfriend at the time for the weekend. He lived like 40 minutes away from campus in a busier area, and this was on a Sunday, and I was headed back to prepare for Monday morning classes and stuff after being gone for the weekend. And I was able to take a pretty big, busy road for the majority of the trip, but the last like 20 minutes as I got closer to campus, I needed to take a much more quiet kind of country road. And I had driven this country road hundreds of times prior to this, and I've driven it another 100 times since this particular night. I have never experienced anything like this before or after, so it was definitely a standalone incident. And like I said, I was very familiar with this road, and the fact that it was dark didn't make much of a difference. I mean, it's a country road, but it's not particularly desolate. There are lots of neighborhoods scattered along it. There's a church, a post office, blah, blah. There are street signs and mailboxes and just kind of all sorts of things all along the drive that I was really familiar with and used to seeing. This particular night, though, I was only about 10 minutes away from school at this point, and I realized as I was driving along this road that the scenery didn't look familiar to me anymore. And as I just said, it's rural, but there are still things all along the road. And in this moment, there was literally nothing around me. There were no cars behind me, so my back window was like completely black. There were no lights from houses, no mailboxes, or anything up ahead of me. It was just my high beams on the stretch of road in front of me and nothing else. You know, I didn't even notice any farm fencing or anything as I continued to drive. I had never, ever noticed a piece of this road before that seemed so desolate. And it was really jarring because of how unfamiliar it was to me. It was almost like my car had tunnel vision. I know that sounds kind of weird, but that's kind of the best way I can explain it. And I talked to myself a lot, so once I realized how weird this was, out loud to myself in the car, I said, "This is creepy." And as soon as I said that, something heavy hit the roof of my car. It was just one big thud. Just one. It did not roll down the back of my vehicle. It didn't bounce in any way. It was just one big bonk, like right above my head. And I never saw what it was, but it sounded like it probably weighed a few pounds, and it was something solid. And it really scared me because I was already weirded out by the road looking so different. So I jumped when I heard it. And I sort of looked up, to the ceiling of the car above, right above me, and said something along the lines of, "Oh my God," or something like that. And that's when the light happened. Oh my God. So this light, you guys, this light was unlike anything I have ever experienced. And before I describe this to you, I feel the need to say that I have a crystal clear medical history, no migraines, seizures, hallucinations. I have perfect vision. I have no neurological deficits whatsoever. I say this because I'm a really practical person, and I don't chalk up every weird thing that happens to hocus pocus. So I've really analyzed like all the practical reasons for this, and I am still completely clueless. So this light, it sort of started on the driver's side, but I say that loosely because there was absolutely no source of this. The best way that I can describe this light to you is that it was a total, complete whiteness. I was literally blind by white light. I was in the white light. It like totally took over my car. It was actually in my car. And I couldn't even see the hand in front of my face. It was so thick. It was just whiteness. Like everything just disappeared and it was white. It was just white. And it lasted a few seconds. And I was awake and like having thoughts this entire time. And then it sort of seemed to kind of leave through the passenger side. Although it more so just kind of vanished like as quickly as it came. And there I was, still just driving down the road. It's a miracle my car didn't run into a tree while this was happening because I couldn't see anything. And I was so hysterical afterward. I called my boyfriend and I was crying and I described what happened to him. And his first reply was like, "Oh my God, maybe aliens were trying to abduct you," which made me freak out even more. It was just all too much, like the suddenly unfamiliar environment, then something hit the roof of my car, and then that insane white light without a source. It was just like boom, 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 all in succession, like these three really bizarre things, and then it was all just over. And, about the light brightness, like we've all seen bright lights before. We've seen spotlights, high beams, whatever. They're bright, but they have like an obvious source, and this one didn't. It was literally in my car with me. That's the best way that I can describe it. And I was unable to see anything around me. And like I said before, I'm a pretty level-headed person, and so is my husband, who is a different guy, not the boyfriend during the time of this story. Neither of us can come up with any plausible explanation for this. My husband's a doctor, so of course he's the one who analyzed whether there was something medically wrong with me that could explain this when I told him the story years after it happened. But I mean, there's nothing, and I've never had any episode like this before, nothing afterward. It was such an isolated incident. I even wondered if my car was struck by lightning. It wasn't raining, but I'm just kind of reaching. Even 10 years later, I'm just as clueless as I was back then, when I try to come up with reasons. And actually, I Googled the lightning thing, and it's pretty obvious when your car is hit by lightning, and this was not lightning. So when I told my husband about it, I was pretty gung-ho on it being aliens. And he said it's kind of silly of me to chalk it up to some sort of alien encounter when I have absolutely no idea if that's what it really was. And once he said, well, maybe it was a ghost or something. That's just as plausible. If you're going to entertain the idea of aliens, I guess you could entertain the idea of a ghost too. And, I guess he has a point, but from what I know about ghosts, though, this experience just doesn't seem to align very well, with common types of hauntings that you hear about. But I suppose it's possible. All I know is that it was very real. It was very terrifying. And it was, not something within me. It happened to me. And I still remember it as clearly today as I did right after it happened 10 years ago. And I have Googled and come up empty-handed. So if any of your listeners have any insight as to what this was, I would love it if you would pass my email address along. And I hope that you enjoyed listening to it. Thanks again for all of your hard work, Lex. The show's great. And as usual, take care.
This is from Lynne in the UK. Peter makes himself known. When I was at college, I became interested in tarot reading. I was often asked to give readings. I seemed to develop a flair for giving very accurate readings for the people I had never met before. Friends of my mother also began to approach me for readings. One time I was asked to do a reading at a party that was held in a house that had been created from 2 or 3 18th century farm cottages in a row. When my mother and I were let in, the whole house appeared to be full of children, and our hostess said that her husband were both in their second marriage and had children from both. At one point, a little boy walked into the room as I was giving a reading to one of the ladies. He was wearing what I took to be a long striped t-shirt or a nightshirt and kept saying very insistently, Peter, do one for me." "Wait a few minutes, Peter," I replied. "I'll do a short one for you after I finish with this lady." I meant to just tell him a few amusing or pleasant things, and then pack him off to his mother. But the lady on the other side of the table gave me a very strange look, and asked me, "Who are you talking to?" She didn't see the little boy at all. When I looked back to him, he had vanished. It struck me then that the nightwear he had been wearing did not look like it was modern. When the hostess came in for her reading, I mentioned to her that Peter had been to see me. She nodded and said casually, "Oh, yes, he's one of our ghost children. There's Peter, and then there's a smaller girl. I often wake in the night to see one of them standing by the side of the bed. As soon as I realize it's not one of our children, I just say goodnight and go back to sleep." As I was going home with my mother in a taxi afterwards, I told her about this little incident, and she said, "Well, I wouldn't have minded if it had been Peter that I saw. They have another ghost in there, a man in a long, black cloak, who stands at the turn of the stairs. And I saw him as I was going into the bathroom. I changed my mind and spent the rest of the evening with my legs crossed." The resident family, she had learned, knew all about the man in black as well. But they usually didn't mention him to visitors, because, although they had got used to seeing